Good morning, everybody. Should we begin? Shalom and welcome. I'm Jessie Sheslow, the Director of Community Relations at the Jewish Federation of Sarasota-Manatee. Thank you for joining this Heller CRC webinar, Tables Turned on Them, Jews Guarding Nazi POWs in the United States, with Dr. Michael Greenberg. The Jewish Federation of Sarasota-Manatee's mission is to strengthen Jewish life and identity for our community, provide for Jewish people in need, and promote support for Israel. We are proud of the programming that we have offered since COVID-19 began and are officially moving with an all virtual program season. We know that you, our community, know how difficult this decision was, but for your safety and the safety of our incredible staff, it's our #1 priority. Please know that the opinions of our guests today do not necessarily reflect those of the Jewish Federation and that this webinar is being recorded. After Michael's presentation, we will go to Q&A. You may ask a question at any time during his presentation. Please use the chat or Q&A function to do so. Now let me introduce our guest today. Dr. Michael J. Greenberg earned a PhD in chemistry from the University of Illinois, Chicago, and worked for over 36 years in the food industry as a scientist at Quaker Oats and R&D Director Technology Fellow at the W.M. Wrigley Jr. Company. As a scientist, he is listed as inventor for over 60 U.S. patents and author of numerous publications in peer-reviewed journals and book chapters. Since his retirement, he applied his scientific skills to finding facts and substantiation for Tables Turned on Them, his first non-technical publication. Dr. Greenberg has been deeply engaged with his synagogue at the greater Chicago area Jewish community for over 30 years. He has held office in every position in his synagogue's men club and was their Man of the Year in 2001 and received their coveted Kavod Award for community service in 2010. He and his wife have lived in Northbrook, Illinois for over 30 years. To remind those of you in attendance, Michael's book, Tables Turned on Them, Jews Guarding Nazi POWs Held in the United States, is for sale through the Jewish Federation. If you are interested in purchasing the book, please check the chat box for information on how. Michael, welcome and thank you for being here. That isn't your home behind you, is it?
No, that's not my newly remodeled family room. That happens to be one of the former barracks where Germans were interred during World War II at the Clinton Prisoner of War Camp, 30 miles outside of Jackson, Mississippi. This is where my father served. So I guess with that, we'll just begin. But good morning and thank you all for taking the time to hear about new Jewish World War II history. A special thank you to the Jewish Federation of Sarasota and Manatee for hosting this presentation, and to Trudy Crames and Jessie Sheslow for organizing the event. Today I'm going to provide a high-level overview of the book, including the background, the research, and my father's story, which was the starting point of all of this. I will speak for about 40 minutes and then open it up for questions. On May 7th, we observed the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II in Europe, and coming up this September 2, the end of hostilities with Japan. By a show of raised hands, who had family members that served during World War II in the armed services? I'm just going to take a quick look here on the grid. Wow, a lot of you did. That's really fantastic. Let me take a look at the other. This is really cool. I bet they had phenomenal stories. Now, are there any veterans that served in the armed forces, regardless what war, whether it's World War II, Korea, Vietnam? Wow, we have some here, at least 3, I see, possibly 4 or 5. Wow, thank you for your service. God bless you. We really appreciate all your efforts for what you've done. So this book has a lot of fascinating stories and puts a spotlight on the importance of education to combat anti-Semitism that continues to increase worldwide. The main conclusion of this book is that these Jewish GIs reset the moral compass and re-educated many of these German POWs so that they could lead or participate in a post-war democratic Germany. Think of this as inoculation against starting another world war and Holocaust. Now I'm going to share my screen here. What's going on here? Something happened here. You're gonna have to excuse me, ladies and gentlemen. I'll have to load this up again. Try it again. There we go. So a little background first. The United States and Great Britain in 1942 entered an agreement by which the United States would accept German prisoners of war and Italian prisoners of war and house them in the United States for the duration of the war. And the reason why this was so was that they wanted to get Germans, captured Germans, out of the theater of operation and free up combat troops to fight rather than to babysit and guard POWs. The second reason why this was needed was that in the United States during World War II, 11 million Americans were off in the armed services, either in the Pacific theater or European theaters or elsewhere, and were not available to be in the workforce. Therefore, there was a labor shortage. These POWs fulfilled a labor shortage. They worked in the farm fields of the United States, the forest, and even in some factories. So this begins with the surrender of the Afrika Corps. Let me move this over a bit. In May 1943 in Tunisia, the first 125,000 Germans were taken prisoner, and over a 6-month period, they were shipped to the United States. Before being sent there, they were interrogated. No SS were allowed in the United States. They all went to Great Britain as part of this agreement. 20% of the population were hardcore Nazi party members. On the flip side, if you think of this as a bell-shaped curve, on the flip side, 20% were anti-Nazis. A number of them never wanted to join the Nazi party, were forced. In fact, there were a number of dissidents that were in the German army. Most people just were unaware of this. Most of these first wave of POWs were in the age range of 20 to 25 years of age. A lot of the data that I obtained about the POWs came from a book written by Arnold Kramer, who's a professor emeritus, now retired, at Texas A&M University, and he's Jewish. So it's sort of ironic that a Jew wrote about the POW experience, and this became the Bible, so to speak, for this topic. After D-Day, another 250,000 arrived in the United States, making a total of 372,000. And they were scattered all over the country in 500 camps. This is a map that was put together in June 44 before additional camps were made. And as you can see, most of the camps are in the southern part of the United States. Arkansas, Mississippi, Texas had the most. The whole idea was to get the POWs away from railheads and cities. So if there were escapes, there was really nowhere to go. There were a number of camps in Florida, and one camp not too far from you folks was up in Stark, Florida, near Jacksonville, was called Camp Blanding, and it created a branch camp in Winter Haven, which is not too far from Sarasota and Tampa Bay. The other major large camp was Gordon Johnston, which was near Tallahassee, right? And so moving along, so my whole project really came by accident. I was in San Diego because my parents were both ill. Their condominium was sold. Both were in skilled care. And during the process of cleaning out my parents' condo after it was sold, trying to figure out what to ship back to Chicago, what to give to charity and so forth, I found a green letter box that contained 50 letters my late father wrote to my late mother during World War II. This documented his entire war experience from basic training all the way to discharge. And this was a real revelation because I found that there were a number of letters, 7 months worth of letters that came from the Clinton prisoner of war camp. I had no idea whatsoever that he served at a prisoner of war camp. He never talked about it. In addition, I found not only his complete discharge report, but a photo album of his experiences, not only in and around the Clinton POW camp, but also once he was shipped off to Europe later during the war. Incidentally, all the letters were written on camp stationery with the Clinton POW camp stationery heading. They all were in the original envelopes with postmarks, and the return address on letters written by GIs, at least when they were in the United States, would indicate what station they were at. In this case, he was at the headquarters of the headquarter detachment of the POW camp at Clinton. And quite often letters would have the serial numbers on them. So this research, this whole thing was placed on hold. I was working, didn't really have time, and wasn't until the end of 2011 I retired. 2013, the Illinois Holocaust Museum had a program on Jews that served during World War II, and I submitted my photograph and a short story about my father's service, and then attended a ceremony there, as did other members of my extended family. And thumbing through the booklets at the Illinois Holocaust Museum about service of other GIs, I didn't find anyone that had service at a POW camp. So that sort of put me in a research mode. And the first question I addressed was, how many Jews were involved in this? How big of an effort was this? Do I have a story? So I found out through the Kramer book that 47,000 American personnel were involved in the POW effort, whether they were military police, translators, physicians, etc. And that I then turned to the Jewish Welfare Board, which had a complete record of the Jewish service, military service during World War II. So 550,000 men and women of the Jewish faith were in uniform during World War II. And this represents 4.5% of the total armed forces. Of those Jews that were in the armed forces, 80% served in the Army, and 8% of those in the Army were in ground force units that were non-combat. So they weren't in infantry, armor, etc. So if you multiply 47,000 by 4.5% times 80% by 8%, it comes out to about 120. This appears to be very low because as I started out doing research, I found out that 33% of all Jewish US physicians were in uniform. 30% of Jewish dentists were in uniform. And so my calculations didn't include any of the medical corps, the dental corps, or the sanitation corps. So this number could be substantially higher than 200. So I started doing research, and first was finding Jewish GIs or the families and friends. And initially I turned to the Jewish war veterans of the United States. They let me put in an ad free of charge in their monthly newsletter for several months. And my first GI responded to it, and he lived north of Milwaukee. My wife and I went to visit him and his family, and this guy brought out this huge album of documentation of his service with photos and letters, and even Army documentation letters showing his service. I then began to validate facts with archival information. Just because someone told me they did service at a POW camp, there had to be proof, there had to be substantiation. So their enlistment records, if they had it, would definitely show it. Discharge papers, letters home, biographies, if they wrote biographies that then went to universities. Believe it or not, There are POW camps that have museums that still exist in small town America, and many of these have documents. Historical societies, particularly the Nebraska Historical Society. It was absolutely insane, the documents that they had and pictures that they had of the 5 or 6 POW camps. And it was a great help to me. And even some things such as Ancestry and Fold 3 were helpful. Now, Ancestry has a lot of what I would call anecdotal stories, but when I was doing pre-war stories of individuals, it was great to get actual government documents such as census documents showing where they lived and what they did, as well as school information. Newspaper.com was very helpful in terms of articles that were written during the war about POW camps and people that served in them. Fold 3 is owned by Ancestry. It has a lot of military records, but quite honestly, if you go to the government, US National Archives, you could get enlistment records directly from them rather than paying money to Fold 3. In addition, I compounded or learned about German POW camps in the United States, mostly only for those where Jews served at. Being a scientist, I don't think and write like a historian, so I had to get an advisor. So I called Arnold Kramer, who Professor Emeritus of Texas A&M, and he retired and he said, "This is a great project, Greenberg. I'm going to give you my crack first PhD student who's now an assistant professor of US history at the Army War College in Virginia." And Derek Mallet was a great help in terms of offering advice on what do I need to substantiate service with. Mallet incidentally wrote a book on the German generals that were interred in the United States, one of which my father guarded at Clinton. So it was sort of interesting that a coincidence here. Background on anti-Semitism in the US and in the Army, press coverage of the Holocaust and the Jewish community response. The reason for this was I wanted to see whether men that served in these POW camps knew about the Holocaust and knew what was going on with respect to the Jewish community response to that. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later. So I needed to identify Jews, and I was getting a lot of responses, but I wanted to reach the greater Jewish community, at least in Chicago. So I contacted the Chicago Jewish News, and the editor, the late Joseph Aaron, contacted me and agreed to do a community service story. And in April 2016, I was interviewed by the reporter George Castle, who writes a lot of books about Chicago baseball, incidentally. And so the article published, it was 3 pages long, cover photo, it was really great, and I got instant hits. 4 GIs, or families of GIs, responded. Irwin Harris was alive at the time I went and interviewed him. Froman, Heinrich, and Wise all had family, had a father who served as translators, and they had documentation up the yin yang. And I went to their homes and interviewed them and photographed their documents. So it was off to a great start, but unfortunately, the Chicago Jewish News website didn't post this story on it. In fact, they rarely put a lot of their current articles on there. Incidentally, the paper just disappeared because the editor, Joseph Aaron, passed away. And so no one took over the paper. But I repeated the article in the Digital Chicago Tribune. And that paper is search engine optimized, which means anyone doing a Google search from anywhere in the world could find this paper and the article. In addition, I placed links to the article on social media. On Facebook, there's genealogy, there's prisoner of war camp museum groups, veterans groups, and I got flooded with results. I had one individual whose son plays soccer on the soccer fields at the Clinton prisoner of war camp. The camp doesn't exist anymore. The barracks behind me were all torn down in the mid-1960s. And Mississippi College is now on the site. But this gentleman whose son played on soccer fields emailed me and was a history buff, and he went to the Clinton Library and pulled out a lot of useful information and sent me over 100 photographs of camp records that should have been sent to Washington, D.C. after the war, but never were. So I learned a lot from that. Additional tools, synagogue bulletins and yard site notices really steered me to individuals where I could get stories. Stefan Fleck, a physician, a German refugee who became a physician that served at one of the largest POW camps in the northwest corner of Alabama. So Stefan Fleck had a yard site notice in a synagogue in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. It's amazing what you find online. So I contacted his daughter, who happened to be the sisterhood president and later became the synagogue president, and she had a lot of documentation about her father's service and steered me to Harvard University, where his biography existed. Obituaries and funeral homes steered me to sites where family members were existing. Harold Bellen, who was the station officer, the largest ranking officer that I found, who was a major. I'll show him a little bit later. And men's clubs, being past president of the Midwest Region Federation of Jewish Men's Club in Chicago and in Milwaukee steered me to families and veterans. One gentleman was an optometrist, and his patient was Sheldon Green, who was a POW camp guard at a camp that was no more than 5 miles away from where I live, Camp Skokie Valley, located in Glenview, Illinois. Jack Weiner lived in Milwaukee, and one of the Milwaukee clubs steered me to him. Jack Weiner became a standout member of the Jewish community after his service. He was the executive officer of the Jewish community centers in Milwaukee and opened up a summer camp in Wisconsin for Jewish youth. So there was a lot of great pre-war stories, war stories, and what these men did after the war, which just was outstanding. So to date, I have 33 Jewish GIs identified. I have detailed validated stories for 17, which means each person that has their name underlined, I have their complete pre-war story, their war service record, and how their pre-war and war service record affected their post-war lives. So you could see I have a number of physicians, a sanitation officer. Greenberg and Silverman were sort of unique. They were the only two that were, after they entered the service, did not directly go to a POW camp after basic training. Silverman was a lieutenant that led a unit, an Army unit that fought on Guadalcanal in 1943. He was shot twice. He got a bad case of malaria. He spent a year in a hospital. And then by early 1944, he was well enough and he was shipped to Camp Robinson or Fort Robinson. And I'll show you that a little later in the presentation. There was a whole list of military policemen that were involved in this effort. And those that have a little asterisk have Chicago roots. And translators, the Army official title was interpreters. A few interesting facts about all this. The eldest person was Dr. Harold Bellen, who was 38 years of age. Next in age was Dr. Leonard Schapiner, who was 37 years of age. Schapiner, anyone having Chicago roots, had a PhD and an MD from the University of Chicago, did an internship at Michael Reese Hospital. So a little sidebar there. Now you'll notice that Dr. Harvey Goldberg was not underlined. I know that he served because I have him in pictures with Bellen and Harris at the Clinton POW Station Hospital. I was never able to find anyone to interview, no relatives. So these two were the oldest. The youngest was Sheldon Cohn and Erwin Harris that were 18 years of age. I interviewed both Cohn and Harris. Another person I interviewed that was fairly young that still survived was John Neumeyer. This guy flooded me with information. After the war, he was the president of 2 different universities. He was the region director of the Midwest region of the Anti-Defamation League. And this guy had a memory that was just crazy. He was a refugee from Nazi Germany. Him and his father escaped. and he brought all his complete photo records. So, I mean, it was just crazy the amount of information he had. So the book is organized where I talk about those that then enter the physical, let's say the POW camps initially. Then I talk about the medical corps, the military police, and interpreters. And for each section, I have a brief introduction about what were the roles and responsibilities of each of these groups and what was the training that they received in basic training. And then I delve into facts. And the book is very friendly to read. It's not a dry history book. It has a lot of good anecdotal, some funny stories, and I'll try to relay a few as we move along. So the take-home message here is the United States spent $340 billion to win World War II. That paid for tanks, planes, people, supplies, ships, etc. After the war in 1948, it spent $13 billion as part of the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan was designed to rebuild Europe, the infrastructure of Europe, and to open up the market so farmers would have a way of getting their produce to market. Manufacturers would be able to get their products to market. And the infrastructure was destroyed during the war by Allied bombing. We did a really great job on that. And so $3 billion each went to France and England, and $2.5 billion went to Germany to rebuild their industry. Incidentally, not their war industry, so their care was taken with that. So there needed to be leaders to lead a post-war democratic Germany. So the US government in late 1944-45 turned to the POW program to train people, to identify and train people as potential future leaders of a post-war democratic Germany. So these red dots show where Jewish GIs served. One guy, Jack Weiner, served all the way at the farthest northern region of Michigan during the dead of winter, where there was 35 inches of snow and the average temperature was 10 degrees above zero. So there'd be no POWs escaping from foresting camps. And the furthest south was Mejia, Texas, where Sheldon Cohn served. So this gives you a sense of where these people served that I wrote about. So why tell the stories? Well, first of all, it's a mitzvah for me. It's new history. People don't have a clue that this occurred. I certainly didn't have it. If it wasn't from my mother finding these letters, I wouldn't be sitting here. Thank God she was a pack rat. What do you think about that? So, so it's an honor. I'm not here to sell books. I'm here to tell the story and share the stories. It's an untold story of heroic action, one of T-Clin alum, and also to encounter generalizations of the quality of soldiers stationed at the POW camps. At the end of the war, the US Army came out with reports that really were disparaging towards the towards the GIs that served there. And this was definitely not the case for the Jewish GIs, and we'll talk about that a little later. So this is the ultimate reason why I wrote this book. This is Irwin Harris. He rode on trains from Boston Harbor all the way to Oklahoma with Pullman carloads of Germans. He was armed with a submachine gun. When a POW needed to use the bathroom, one of the three, let's say, guards on the train had to escort them to the bathroom to make sure they wouldn't try to jump out the window. So Irwin Harris finally served at a POW camp in Roswell, New Mexico. Yes, that's the camp that's stationed right out of the UFO Center of the United States. But Harris had a lot of great stories. My book was published in February 2019. I provided copies of the books to all the families that contributed things, to all the GIs that were living, that they would have a record of their achievements. Harris was the last living GI. And in March 2019, 1 month after I gave him this book, that's his daughter, incidentally, behind him, Sheila Polak, he passed away. I attended the funeral. The family asked me to do a eulogy on his military service, which I did. And let me tell you, this made all the blood, sweat, and tears of 4 years of research, 1 year of writing and editing worthwhile. So It's an untold story of heroism. These men entered POW compounds without weapons. They were outnumbered 1 to 8. In many cases, it was 20 to 1. They received anti-Semitic threats from some of the POWs. And quite honestly, most of these men grew up in diverse neighborhoods and were called dirty Jews and all sorts of slurs when they played team sports or from school. So name calling was no big deal. It was when they received death threats, then they took action. In most cases, the POWs that made the threats were then placed in solitary confinement. They faced abuse from the army in some cases, anti-Semitism. Most of the time it was verbal abuse. And in some cases it was discrimination for impeding promotion and career opportunities. In this case, these Jews, 9 times out of 10, would transfer. There was a little opportunity to stay observant in these POW camps because they were located in areas where there certainly weren't any synagogues. These were rural areas. When interviewed and asked, most deny that they were heroes. I was just doing my duty. So this is the major story here is one of Tikkun Olam, repair of the world. And Rabbi Schneerson says it best, if you find something that needs to be repaired and you know how to repair it, it's a piece of the world God has left for you to complete. But if you see what's wrong and do nothing about it, you're the one that needs to be repaired. So the Jews began their Tikkun Olam and repair the world by repairing individuals. Many of these GIs that are in the book had one-on-one interactions. And these included sharing stories. The POWs had families in the US and shared stories about them with the GIs. They wanted to learn about Jewish GIs. Why did these guys, these Jews, look different from the Jews that lived in Europe or in North Africa where they came from? Geneva Convention, POWs were allowed to work. Jews trained them and supervised them. They were able to take, the POWs were able to take university courses, and Jews taught internal courses. There were, let's see, there were 15 major German and Austrian universities that accepted grades at face value from some 103 US colleges that were participating in this education program. This was something that I was just shocked at, but actually it was a good thing, teaching POWs that were brainwashed about the Constitution and Bill of Rights. The re-education program took a formal government, let's say, turn, where the government, US government, required every POW to see the consequences of Nazism. In July, starting in July 1945, all POWs were forced to see concentration camp films. Then they were required to hold discussion groups with it, about it. Formal re-education programs, primarily for anti-Nazis, were started in late 1944 and early 45. Special camps were set up to train people to be mayors, police chiefs, and other items of infrastructure. And in January 1946, at Fort Eustis, which is about 75 miles of, what's the name of that? Anyways, it's in Virginia, right on the coast. And that camp, 1,000 POWs per week entered an intense course of training on democracy, economics, and on speaking good English. They attended English courses. And then at the end of each session, there was a graduation course. 22,000 attended this. So POWs that went through the re-education program were allowed to return directly back to Germany. The other 350,000 POWs at the end of the war, and this was by the last POWs were shipped out in June 46. All these men went to either France or Great Britain, where they spent an additional year for war reparations. Then they returned to their bombed out cities in Germany. So the Jewish GIs that I talk about were change agents and enablers. They reset the POW moral compass. So as I mentioned before, I talk about pre-war, war service, post-war in the book. That's how it's organized. And today I'm going to give you a top-line review of one GI, which is my late father, which started the whole effort. And so my father served at the Clinton POW camp. Here it is on a map outside of Jackson. With him were 4 others, and I have 3 of them pictured. I couldn't fit the 4th on here. Harold Bellen was the highest ranking Jew that I found. He was a major. And the Bellen family flooded me with information, photos, videos that were converted to MP4s. It was just insane. Raymond Harris reported, he was a surgeon that reported to Harold Bellen. And the 2 of them operated on POWs to remove shrapnel and bullets and so forth after they were shipped from North Africa to Clinton. He grew up in a rural region of Georgia, Osceola, Georgia, where only 10 Jews lived. Froman was a refugee from Germany, and that his son attended the same grammar school and high school I did. In fact, his son contacted me about the article in the Jewish News, and it was really funny because our parents probably attended PTA meetings and could have sat next to each other, but neither one knew that they were at the camp. So my father didn't know Bellen, Harris, or Froman, and Froman didn't know these 3, but these 2 knew each other quite well. In fact, for those of you that like Jewish cooking, and I assume all you women just love to whip up matzo balls and so forth, Harold Bellen's wife was a famous author, Mildred Grossberg Bellen. She wrote the go-to cookbook for Jewish cooking. It was called the Jewish Cookbook. And it was the go-to book, very popular book in 1930s, 40s, and 50s. In fact, they would serve immaculate Passover seders during 1944-45. Meanwhile, my father was stuck at the POW camp, could never go to a seder, as was Froman. So this gives you an idea of what a POW camp looks like. And to give you an idea of scale, this field here that says POW Enlisted Men's Recreation Area are 2 soccer fields that are lengthwise back to back. This is an area where the highest ranking officers captured during World War II were kept. This is where the enlistment men were kept. And then there's a station hospital, and then there's barracks. That's where the guard was. The POWs and the U.S. personnel stationed there had to have the same housing, bedding, eat the same food, all required by Geneva Convention. This gives you a little better view of this. Each one of these barracks held 50 men. So this camp held 3,600. So each one of these streets, they're called compounds 1, 2, and 3, held about 1,200 prisoners of war. So my father's story, pre-war, he was born in Chicago, a Chicago native, lived on the South Side. He graduated from Inglewood High School, and that particular high school was 25% African American, or 25% Black, as it's now called, and 12% Jewish, and the rest were a mix of German, Irish, and whatever ethnic group you could think of that was there. He was raised as an Orthodox Jew. Yiddish was spoken in the house. During high school, my father took 2 years of German, specialized in chemistry, and played baseball on the baseball team. After the war, he wanted to become a doctor, so he entered a pre-med program at a junior college, and the junior college system went belly up and went bankrupt during the Depression. So my father and one of his brothers put together enough money to open a liquor store on the south side of Chicago in a Black area. It was very successful, and he gained a lot of experience in inventory control, hiring and firing, marketing, and everything an entrepreneur does. Pearl Harbor comes along, and he's drafted in July 1942, so he's 29 years of age. Incidentally, the average age of the infantry was 26 years of age, and only half of them had an high school graduation. All the Jews that I wrote about graduated high school. Quite a few of them had college and postgraduate experience. Of course, all the doctors did. Silverman that you saw up front, the guy that was shot on Guadalcanal, was a lawyer. So within a short period of time, my father received 3 promotions to a sergeant, technical grade 2. His career was on a fast track. He was a medical supply sergeant at Camp Swift, located outside of Waco, Texas. He passed the officer candidate school test at the request of the commanding officer of his division. He asked him to take the test, which consisted of 3 components: a physical exam, a written exam, and an oral defense, in which the commanding officer and 2 of his cronies pepper you with questions about what you would do under certain combat situations. So he was then told you'll receive orders within about a month and a half to report to Fort Benning in Georgia for officer school. In the interim, his whole unit was shipped out to Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas for additional training. They were then transferred back to Camp Swift after 3 months. And then he found out you have to retake the entire officer candidate school test again. He has a new commanding officer who was an anti-Semite. And how do we find this out? Well, he took 3 tests. He passed all 2 of them, the written and the physical exam. He then took the oral exam and he failed it. And the only questions that he was asked were about his ethnic background, why his parents went to a church, etc., etc. Nothing to do with combat or anything to do with the service. And there were no explanations offered why he failed the test. And with that, he requested a transfer, and he went from the frying pan into the fire. So he was then transferred to Clinton Prisoner of War Camp, and the letters home tell the story. First letter that my late mother received indicated this place is a mud hole. It's muddy, smoky, damp, and dirty. They're not strict here. The weather here is miserable. It's rained for 2 days in a row. Then later he writes in the next letter, it rained for 10 days in a row. And you see the reasons why I'm not in one of my best moods. And here he is standing outside the barracks. Next, he gets to meet his new friends. February 27, he writes, "Dear Betty, they," which is the German POWs, "hate Jews. They know I am one. Some doubt that I'm Jewish, but I've assured them that I am Jewish. I guess there are better places to be." This was a common theme amongst GIs I interviewed. You do not look Jewish. And we're going to get to that in a moment. But my father's saying, "Hineni, here I am. I'm Jewish. Deal with it. You're under my control, and you'll be under my control for the rest of the duration of the war until I'm transferred." And further letters indicate that despite his rocky start, he stopped trying to transfer. Humor reappeared in letters. And why? He writes his very last letter before he's transferred to Europe. This job is without doubt the easiest yet in the Army. He had a roof over his head, 3 square meals, and he had Germans that reported to him. He had his own command. So let's explore this theme a little bit. I don't look Jewish. So the German youth that from the Afrika Corps, average age were 22, which meant in the mid-1930s they were either grammar school or middle school age. And here's one of the textbooks looked like that they were shown. They were taught to hate Jews from an early age in their schooling. This book, Don't Trust a Fox in a Green Meadow, warned both of a Jew. And you can see even the geese are honking at the Jews. And the characters of the Jews, they're all grubby looking, unshaven, obese, hunched over, disheveled looking, devious looking. Another book showed the ideal Aryan versus the Jewish businessmen that looked shady, obese, smoked, unshaven. Then when they wound up in Tunisia, after Rommel's Afrika Corps was defeated at El Alamein, which was a good thing, because if they would have won that battle, they would have gone directly into what's known as Israel today and taken over that country. But from El Alamein, they went to Tunisia, and the Allies hemmed them in and surrounded. Rommel left and then was replaced by another general that you're going to meet later. And This is what they saw in terms of Jews that were enslaved to build tank defenses in Tunisia. Then they get to a POW camp and they meet Jews that are clean, fit, trim, buff, held rank. This is Sergeant John Neumeyer, who served at Fort Robinson in Nebraska. And so this was culture shock. So just the appearance of what Jews looked like stimulated conversations. His February 27th letter indicated, I now have 2 companies that report to me, and he's in a supply depot. Each has their own German sergeant who are under my direct supervision. And when you're in a building on a daily basis for months at a time with individuals, conversations are going to naturally break out. And they did. He indicated that the prisoners caused no trouble. There were 8 guards to 1,000 POWs. If trouble breaks out by the time help arrives, I'll be a goner. But he didn't really need to. He got along fine with them. They held conversations in broken German and English. Several of the prisoners spoke very good English. And a number of them had relatives living in the US, Chicago, New York, and Detroit. In fact, families of prisoners of war in the United States found out where their relatives were interred and were sending them care packages. Meanwhile, US personnel that were in prisoner of war camps in Germany, flyers and maybe infantrymen that were captured, were living under really bad conditions. But we lived up to the Geneva Convention. Someone had to act civilized. Passover comes around. There's no opportunity to observe it in this prisoner of war camp. There's no Seder, there's no matzah, it's just another week. While he was at Camp Swift, he went to a Seder at a friend's home who was Jewish in Waco, Texas. But in this case, unlike the physicians that lived in Jackson, Mississippi, could attend synagogue, and the synagogue Bethel, located in Jackson, Mississippi, did have Seders in 1944 and 45 for the GIs that were stationed there. Just my father and Froman never got leave to go to attend these. But he censors and opens up packages sent to the POWs. And he writes, here's his dry sense of humor appearing, during the week of Passover, I looked for matzah and packages sent to POWs. If I found any, it would be one for Ripley's, believe it or not. So you can see he does have a sense of humor here despite what's going on. And speaking of food, this is a typical menu of what the POWs would eat and the GIs would eat at Clinton. This is an actual menu from May 12, 1944, when my father was there. And as you can see, lunch they served roast pork. Supper they had meatloaf and milk. And so it's tough to be an observant Jew due to the menu. You had to make shifts in what you ate. By Geneva Convention, you had to actually provide the exact same menu and food to the GIs as well as the prisoners of war. And here you could see the dining hall as it existed in December 44. You could see they have a Christmas tree up there, not a Hanukkah bush. In July 1944, my mother received a letter that indicated that my father now is a jailer, a guard for the highest ranking Nazi general captured during World War II. He was put in charge of the officers' compound. One of the generals that was there was von Arnim, who surrendered the Afrika Corps in May 1943. He inspects the buildings daily. Due to security reasons, there were no detail provided in subsequent letters. Von Arnim was released in 47 and died in Germany in 1962. So 2 questions popped in my mind when I read this letter. It's like, holy cow, they had a Jewish sergeant guarding a Nazi general. What in the name of hell is going on here? Plus, who's this guy von Arnim? Did he have blood on his hands? Is he a war criminal that sort of managed to sneak under the radar? So I began doing research. And my research indicated von Arnim was likely a war criminal. 2 recent books clearly demonstrate von Arnim's involvement in the deaths of 2,600 Tunisian Jews during his command in Tunis. Under his subordinates and an SS commander, Rausch, 5,000 Jews were enslaved to build defense perimeters around Tunis. These Jews were not allowed in air raid shelters, and many were killed in Allied bombing raids. And if someone's interested, I could provide the names of these books because it shows the Arab complicity with the Nazis, that this SS commander Rausch, his intention was to create concentration camps throughout the Middle East with the complicity of Arabs being guards. In fact, there were Arab SS units, one of which fought with the Afrika Corps. They didn't do very well. They turned tail and ran when the first action came up. But there were SS units in the Balkans that were composed of Arabs. And it makes a very interesting read because it talks about the role that the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem plays. So if you go to the Jewish Virtual Library, which I did way back in about 4 or 5 years ago, there was a glowing account about von Arnim being a fine Prussian general. I then wrote the authors of that website, the man should have been hung, and here's the facts. Why don't you change your website? I haven't gone on since. So that's a lesson on why you need to be careful what you read on websites. Now, why did my father wind up guarding these people? Well, some of the information in my advisor's book about Hitler's generals entered the US talked about von Arnim. When von Arnim arrived in Mississippi, it was after he stayed in an estate in Great Britain where he and other German generals received the royal treatment. Really nice meals, cognac and cigars after meals, silk pajamas, except all the rooms in this estate were bugged. The Allies were trying to get them cozied up so they could learn about facts because they were getting ready to invade Normandy. Unfortunately, they didn't learn anything, so they shipped them to Clinton. The camp was under construction at that time. Construction was completed, and von Arnim arrived. Immediately upon arrival, he demanded to see Eisenhower. Now, this is late June 1944. There is no way Eisenhower's going to see him. He's involved with the campaign in Normandy. Next, he demanded that he have cigars, pajamas, a swimming pool for the officers, a tennis court for the officers. Can you believe the audacity of this man? Well, the commanding officer of the prisoner of war camp was Colonel James McElhaney. Who here likes Mexican food? Just do a quick hand raise. Well, a few of you. Now, those of you that like Mexican food may like Tabasco sauce. Well, McElhaney comes from the family that makes McElhaney Tabasco sauce. And you'll still find it today in many Mexican restaurants. That was the family business. But McElhaney served in the army during World War I, fought in France, and had some very bitter experiences with combat and despised Germans. In fact, when he was named commanding officer of Clinton, he asked that his officers do not return salutes of any German officer and just treat them like a normal prisoner. Well, von Arnim complained to the International Red Cross and the Swiss delegations that would appear on a quarterly basis to each of the POW camps to make sure we were complying with the Geneva Convention. Reports would go directly back to Germany. Well, in this case, a report went to the Provost Marshal's office in Washington, D.C. They then contacted McElhaney, who relented and built a clay tennis court, which still exists on the camp grounds. But in return, he sent a Jewish sergeant to stick it to the German officers that we have religious freedom in the United States and we believed in equal rights, although the African Americans in the armed services certainly didn't get that. And that's why my father wound up inspecting all these officers. So life continued. And then by August 3, he was transferred to a general hospital and then shipped out to France. He worked in a hospital in Le Mans, France, where he was in charge of men that would sterilize bandages and make IV solutions with drugs. The war ends in Europe, and here you see the VE parade in Le Mans, France. This is a photo that my father took of the victory parade. He was then transferred for invasion training. There were units in the United States or in the, let's say Europe, Army units in Europe that weren't shipped back to the States were trained to invade Japan. And then once we dropped the bombs, then the training stopped. During the training, he suffered a back injury. He was hospitalized, then finally discharged in December 1945. The back injury haunted him for the rest of his life. So how did his war experience affect him and his experience in Clinton? He wanted nothing to do with bureaucratic organizations or the corporate world. Never was an officer in his men's club, never joined the VW post, always was an entrepreneur or worked for small businesses. It was the Army bureaucracy that my father hated, the constant paperwork of a supply sergeant. Every time he went and inspected the officer's compound, he had to issue reports for each officer. It was just a paperwork blizzard. So, but he was very sensitive to minority needs. When he worked at a small business in the Chatham area of Chicago, which is a black area, he hired from the community and gave many a chance for a job. He had a store on the 63rd Street, which was a black area, and Operation Push, which then was known as the Southeast Community Organization, had their headquarters above his shoe store, and he gave them a break on rent. And here's a picture of myself and brother and my mother, and that's Clarabelle the Clown. We have to have a little levity in this topic. And so that was one of the publicity stunts that he did for his shoe store. And right before he retired from a general merchandising store called Monroe Wholesale, here he's pictured with some of his employees that worked for him. His store was one of the few stores, the place that he worked at, was one of the few stores that was not burned during the riots that took place after the assassination of Martin Luther King. When asked about his service, he would only mention Europe and his service in a hospital. He would go on a diatribe about officer ignorance and racism, but he never talked about Clinton or the POWs, and neither did my mother, who knew all about the letters. And it remains a mystery to this day why neither told me about it. But now my father's side was one man that interacted maybe with 100 POWs. These two men were stationed, were stationed at Fort Robinson, which is in the northwest corner of Nebraska. Reason why I bring them up, I could do a separate talk just on these two guys alone, which I've done. But Silverman was an attorney from Boston. I mentioned to you before, he saw service in Guadalcanal, was shot twice, had a bad case of malaria, hospitalized for over a year. Then he was trained to be what's known as an intellectual diversion program officer, and the official title was assistant executive officer. This was to hide the program from the Swiss and Italian delegations so they wouldn't go back and tell the Germans that we were brainwashing their POWs, when in fact we were deprogramming them. So Silverman headed this program at Fort Robinson. It was very successful. John Neumeyer was a translator at that particular fort, was very much involved in that program. His mother and father were famous people in Frankfurt, Germany. His mother was a famous opera star. After Kristallnacht, Neumeyer went out with a Leica camera and took pictures of the destruction and of the stores and the synagogues. And he was able to get away with it because he was blue-eyed and blonde-haired. He didn't look like a Jew, he looked like a German. Him and his father were able to get out of Germany. They settled in Minneapolis. His mother never got a visa, and she perished in a concentration camp. He didn't find out until well after the war. But Neumeyer was assigned as a translator and was very much involved in the re-education program. Silverman spoke fluent German and would actually translate summaries of films that were shown to the POWs. And many of the films were about US industry. One film was about the Fighting Sullivans that all perished in Guadalcanal. And Silverman had a great respect from the POWs because he was a combat vet. So, conclusion on these, the whole area, All these 17 GIs came from diverse backgrounds. They grew up with other races, religions. A number of them experienced anti-Semitism before the Army. They all had life and education experiences that prepared them for their war service. They all graduated from high school. Many attended college. Some started their own businesses and were running businesses before the war. Some played team sports or in ROTC and experienced anti-Semitism. 11 were promoted. So they were bar mitzvah, ethical, and observant pre-war Jews. And they had the mental and moral strength to persevere and withstand fear or difficulty dealing with POW guards or dealing with POWs. They were not the dumb bunglers that the Army described in post-war reports concerning military police and translators that were serving at these places. So what did they all have in common? They had both positive and negative experience with POWs. Staying observant was hard to do in a POW camp, all except for the physicians. All had meaningful post-war lives. They all led successful business or academic careers. And for example, Jason Silverman that you saw at Fort Robinson was the executive director of communication for the Anti-Defamation League headquarters in Washington, D.C. And Neumeyer, the translator, was a president of two different colleges, Minnesota State, which still has a dormitory named after him, and State University of New York at Fouts, where he served as president as well. After the war, he became a reporter for a newspaper. Most of these people had Jewish children, these guys that were bar mitzvah and ethical Jews. So the real question, did these Jews know about the Shoah? And how could they treat these POWs as soldiers? All interviewed knew about Kristallnacht. The German refugees, the families or the individual soldiers knew the score because they were there. They experienced Kristallnacht and the aftermath, the Nuremberg laws. Others were in the Army before 1942, November 42, when Rabbi Weiss announced the reports of the Shoah. There was limited coverage of that in the press, even though the Jewish community held these massive rallies, but the papers didn't pick it up. Local papers near the basic training camps were not the New York Times and had mostly stories about what was going on in the Pacific or Europe. The U.S. Army magazines, Stars and Stripes and Yanks, did not report the camp liberations or even that they existed until April and May 1945. So I asked Neumeyer, who was a German refugee, still alive. We had plenty of conversations. And one of my last conversations was to sort of poke him about this issue. You know, how could you treat these as soldiers? Didn't you want to beat the hell out of them? And he goes to me, Michael, these POWs were victims. They were brainwashed at a very early age. And specifically said, the Geneva Convention helped set the tone. We did not want to behave like Nazis. So this is repair the world by repair of individuals, resetting the moral compass. So Elliot Dorff says it best that degrading others is prohibited by the Jewish tradition. We do not have to like everyone or approve of what they do, but we have to respond to them even when condemning their behavior. And these Jews were raised with an understanding of halakha. They knew very well about tzedek, justice, tzedakah, compassion, and tikkun olam, repair of the world. So they were well aware of these ethics and civil and criminal laws. And when they were in synagogue as growing up, they would study after the Saturday morning service, Pirkei Avot, or Ethics of the Father. And one of the lines in there, it's wrong to side with the majority to do wrong. And this is part of their Jewish DNA. So how many people did they possibly interact with? The people that were in the book could have interacted with 51,000 of them, but specifically Neumeyer and Silverman easily interacted with 3,000. Neumeyer taught at 3 education courses and had one-on-one contact with 24,000 because he taught lecture courses and he did recitation courses. The 4 physicians easily interacted with over 300-400. So did they make a difference? So more prisoners of war from the Fort Robinson camp entered the re-education program at Fort Eustis. They were anti-Nazis. So 800 people out of a fort of 3,400 POWs entered a program of 22,000. One Fort Eustis graduate, Baron Rudiger von Weckmar, became the West Germany ambassador to the United Nations in 1979. Two Clinton POW hospital workers that were allowed to work in the station hospital by the commanding officer, Harold Bellen, who was Jewish, both became physicians after the war. One physician, Gustav Joachim, I chased down, and I found that after the war, he did post-war reparation work in France, returned to Germany, went to Heidelberg University, became an MD, did an internship in Germany, got married, brought his young wife to Columbus, Ohio, and set up a heart clinic in Columbus, Ohio. He died about 5 years ago. His obituary indicated he was a stellar member of the community, gave to all manner of philanthropic groups. Both his sons are physicians, and it indicated that he was a veteran of World War II. It just failed to mention what army he fought for, which I thought was a little humorous. And I contacted one of his sons, who put me in touch with his widow, who sent me all manner of artifacts. And here he is, sitting on the left, Gustav Joachim, and to the right is Huber, in their laboratory coats outside the station hospital. The man in the middle was in charge of the motor pool, so he has nothing to do with the hospital. There were post-war communications and testimonials. A prisoner of war veteran by the name of Teskey was interviewed by the Imperial War College in London, where there's digital tapes where he talks about his treatment by the two physicians at Clinton removing shrapnel. There were letters between prisoners of war and Jack Weiner, who lived in Milwaukee. These continued for about 5 years after the war. Those particular POWs were former journalists and artisans. Many POWs traveled to the United States for reunions. This just blew me away. There were 40 and 50-year reunions. POWs, hundreds of them, brought their family members to POW camps out in Kishna. Fort Robinson, northwest corner of Nebraska, held one. And one of the former spokesmen, Wolfgang Dorschel, brought his family there. And there were Nebraska Historical Society historians there to interview him. They published the whole event in a peer-reviewed history journal. And Dorschel talked about his experience with Silverman, where Jason Silverman and Dorschel traveled to North Dakota by car. And Silverman took a detour through Custer State Park and showed Wolfgang Dorschel Mount Rushmore. And Dorschel remembered that. It stuck with him as a defining moment of his internment, and said that he visited the Temple of Democracy. So what's next for me? The book was published. I got a lot of positive reviews. A lot of stories are emerging. I'm mulling over whether doing a second book. I know the Federation has copies of the book. It makes a great educational tool. So if you don't want to buy one for yourself, buy one to donate to a Jewish high school, a Hillel, a synagogue, or even a public library. Many of the family members that I gave books to bought books for the U.S. Holocaust Museum, the Illinois Holocaust Museum, the National World War II Museum, and Pritzker Military Museum have copies of my book there. And if you happen to buy a book from the Federation, you'll get an autographed copy with a complimentary bookmark. If you don't want to buy the book, it's cool. If nothing else, donate money to the Federation's cause on helping the community deal with COVID-19. It's a great way it's a great mitzvah for you to perform. So I'm going to end with this slide. This was shot out of a German bunker on Utah Beach in August 2017. My wife and I were there. We're taking a tour with a historian that wrote a number of books about D-Day. And as you can see out of the beach, children are playing in the sand. There's a man looking in binoculars. There's a few people in the water. But yet you see the scars of war. 200 US soldiers died right on this beach between this bunker and another bunker that was diagonally opposed the other direction. You can see there's shrapnel marks here. There's barbed wire that still exists. And that's a reminder that we fought and we died on beaches like this to give people an opportunity to have a free life and to enjoy these type of beaches. So I'm going to end with a line directly out of the Saturday morning services. The prayer for peace. I will rid the land of vicious beasts, and it shall not be ravaged by war. So veterans and the Jewish veterans that served in the armed forces and those that served in these POW camps, thank you for making this possible. And with that, I'm going to open it up for questions, any
Great.
questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Michael. What a fascinating presentation. We have run very long, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time. So we're going to go to one question. And Michael, I ask that we keep the answer as concise as possible. You know, a lot of the questions that we got in were already answered in your presentation, but one I think is something that we want to dig in a little more on. We're amazed to find out that German POWs were held in the United States. Why weren't they held in Europe?
They had to get out of the theater of operation because we had to free up troops, not to guard POWs, but to fight. Now, to give you an idea, right, there were 372,000 that were ultimately shipped to the US. On Easter Sunday, 1945, 300,000 German soldiers en masse surrendered. We were stretched with personnel to guard them and feed them. We didn't have enough K rations to feed them and feed our own troops. So it becomes a liability on your ability to operate as an army to defeat an army, an Axis army. So that was the major reason. The other reason was we needed a labor force. These Germans worked in cotton fields, harvested cotton. They harvested other crops and commodities, worked in forests, cut down trees that were ultimately used in building of homes and so forth. So without that labor force, we would have been in trouble meeting our demand. Now, they weren't permitted to work on things that was related to the war, but in Milwaukee at Billy Mitchell Field, there was a group of POWs that assembled batteries that were used for walkie-talkies. So I hope that answers the question adequately.
It's a really good answer, and something I'm sure that many of us who were not in the service at all wouldn't think of. So thank you for that. I want to wrap it up, and I want to thank our guest, Michael Greenberg, and for all of you for attending. Again, if you are interested in his book, you may contact Brianna in the office, or if you have a relationship with any one of us staff members, you can get in touch with us to do so. From all of us at the Jewish Federation, thank you for joining us. Stay safe and be well.
Could I make one mention here? If people have questions, if they want to email the Federation, you could send them to me, and I promise to provide answers back.
Yep, wonderful. Thank you for that.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.